The war in Europe was supposed to be over, but for the men of the Third Army, the ghosts were just starting to appear. It was late April, 1945. The air didn't smell like the victory everyone was talking about back in London or New York. In the deep, suffocating forests near the Czech border, it smelled of wet pine needles, exhaust fumes from idling Sherman tanks, and the cold, metallic scent of impending death. Imagine you're a scout. You've been through the mud of France and the frozen hell of the Ardennes. You're tough, you're tired, and you've seen things that would make a normal man lose his mind. As you push through the gray morning mist, you expect to find a hidden 88mm gun or a squad of SS snipers waiting to take one last American life. But then, the mist parts, and you see a column of figures. Your heart stops. You level your Garand, finger twitching on the trigger. But you don't fire. Because as the figures get closer, you realize they aren't men. In the title of this video, we mentioned 200 prisoners. But the truth is, in the chaos of that forest, nobody could count them exactly. The veterans who were there, the men of the 11th Armored, recall a sea of small, shivering bodies. Somewhere between 210, maybe as many as 230 children. These were the werewolves of the Hitler Youth. Boys, some barely 10 years old, wearing helmets that were so big they had to tilt their heads back just to see you. They were clutching rifles that looked like toys in their small hands, but the bullets inside were very real. The official standing orders from the Supreme Command were cold and clear. No fraternization. All enemy personnel, regardless of age, are to be processed and interned in POW camps. To the high command in their clean offices, these were combatants. But to the American soldiers standing in that mud, they were just terrified orphans of a madman's dream. What happened next was a secret that could have ended the careers and the honor of every American soldier in that forest. It led to a confrontation that shook the very foundations of the U.S. Army's legal system. Today, we're looking at the moment when a career-hungry colonel tried to destroy his own heroes for showing mercy. And the day General George S. Patton proved that he wasn't just a machine of blood and guts, but a man who knew exactly where the line between a warrior and a murderer was drawn. By the spring of 1945, Hitler's Third Reich was cannibalizing its own children. The Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth were all that remained to fill the gaps in the front lines. These kids weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were victims of a massive, decade-long psychological experiment. They had been fed a diet of hate and told that Americans were subhuman monsters who would execute them on sight. When the American scouts surrounded the group of roughly 230 boys, they didn't see the werewolf saboteurs described in the intelligence reports. They saw a tragedy. These kids were starving, their eyes sunken, their skin gray from months of hiding in damp cellars and frozen trenches. One sergeant later recalled the sight of a 12-year-old boy whose boots were falling apart, his feet wrapped in bloody newspapers to keep out the frost. The Americans had every reason to be brutal. They had just liberated the concentration camps. They had seen the gas chambers and the piles of bodies. They knew what the swastika stood for. But as they looked at these 230 trembling children, something in the American spirit refused to break. Engagement. Bait. Here's a question for you, and I want you to be honest in the comments. If you were that sergeant, standing in that forest with the weight of the war on your shoulders and a direct order to imprison every enemy you found, what would you do? Would you follow the book, or would you follow your heart? Let's talk about it below. It's your comments that help us keep these difficult historical questions alive. The sergeant looked at his men. He saw the same exhaustion in their eyes. He knew that if he put these kids behind barbed wire, many of them wouldn't survive the starvation and disease that was sweeping through the POW camps. He looked at the 230 boys, shared his own K-rations with them, and then did something that was technically treason. "Go home to your mothers," he said. "The war is over for you." He thought the forest would swallow the secret, but in an army of millions, someone is always watching. Someone who cares more about the rules than the people they are meant to protect. A few days later, word reached a colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Let's call him the desk warrior. This was a man who lived for the paperwork. While Patton's men were dodging 88mm shells, this colonel was worrying about whether every form was signed in triplicate. When he heard that an entire unit had released nearly 230 enemy combatants without authorization, he didn't see an act of mercy. He saw a Class A violation of standing orders regarding the security of the rear. In his mind, those 230 boys weren't children. They were potential insurgents. He argued that by letting them go, the American soldiers had effectively armed the enemy for a guerrilla war. He spent a week building a massive dossier, interviewing young privates and bullying them until he had enough evidence to demand a general court-martial. He wanted the sergeant and his lieutenant stripped of their rank, dishonorably discharged, and sentenced to years of hard labor in a military prison. The colonel was convinced he had a winning case, and he thought he knew exactly how to get it approved. He knew General Patton's reputation for iron-fisted discipline. He knew about the slapping incident in Sicily, where Patton had struck a soldier for having shell shock. He assumed Patton would be his biggest ally in crushing these sentimental soldiers. He requested a meeting at Patton's headquarters, a grand, requisitioned mansion that felt more like a tomb than a home. The colonel walked in, his uniform pristine, his map case polished to a mirror shine. He found Patton sitting behind a desk. Patton didn't even look up. He just kept staring at a map, his fingers tracing the lines of his divisions as they raced toward Berlin. The silence in the room was deafening, the kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. The colonel began his presentation. He talked for 15 minutes, laying out the legal framework, citing the Articles of War, and emphasizing the danger those 230 children posed to the security of the Third Army. He described the release as an unforgivable breach of command integrity. Patton just sat there, the cigar smoke curling around his head like a halo of war. He didn't interrupt. He just listened with a look of growing, icy disgust. Finally, the colonel finished and laid the court-martial recommendation on the mahogany desk. "We need to make an example of them, General," the colonel said, his voice full of self-importance. "We cannot allow our men to decide which orders they will follow based on their feelings." Patton slowly took the cigar out of his mouth. He stood up, and in that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room. He walked around the desk, his polished boots clicking on the floor like a drumbeat. He stopped inches away from the colonel's face. "Colonel," Patton growled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You've spent this war looking at law books. My men have spent it looking at the insides of their best friends. Do you know why my army is the most effective fighting force in the history of the world? It's not because they follow every chicken shit regulation you write in your warm little office. It's because they still have enough American character to know the difference between a soldier and a victim." He picked up the file, the 60 pages of evidence against his own heroes. "You want me to court-martial soldiers who showed more strategic sense than you have in your entire body? These 230 boys aren't combatants. They are the pathetic debris of a regime I came here to destroy. If my men had to feed them, guard them, and move them, it would take away from our focus on killing the real enemy. By letting them go home, they saved American rations and American lives. With a sudden, violent movement, Patton ripped the entire dossier in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. He didn't stop until the papers were a heap of white scraps on the floor. I will not have the record of the Third Army stained by your bureaucratic cowardice. If you ever bring me a request to punish a man for having a soul again, I will have you transferred to a mine-clearing detail by sunset. Now get out of my sight before I lose my temper. The court-martial was dead. The sergeant and his men returned to their units, eventually going home to America with their honors intact. They kept the secret of that forest for decades. And those 230 boys? They didn't become insurgents. They went back to their farms and became the generation that rebuilt Germany. They grew up remembering that when the world was at its darkest, an American soldier gave them a second chance instead of a bullet. Patton was a hard man, often a brutal one. But in that office, he proved that a true warrior knows when to break the rules to preserve humanity. He chose the soul of his army over the ink of a rulebook. Final call to action. If you stand with Patton, type mercy in the comments. Your engagement helps us keep these untold stories alive. Subscribe to War POV with Mike for more deep dives into the shadows of history.
This was Mike. Stay sharp and never forget that history is written in the shadows.